Rise of China. I'm Avery Goldstein. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, also director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China there at Penn. And let me just offer a few opening remarks before I turn it over to our speakers. Today's event, I think, is an especially timely one because in the past few months, we're seeing a reinvigorated debate among analysts, scholars, and policymakers focusing on the challenge of managing U.S.-China relations. In the United States, I think this is reflected in a sharply renewed debate and disagreement about the adequacy of what's been a consistent and I think until recently largely bipartisan approach to dealing with a rising China and its growing military and economic capabilities. Because I think in this new debate, despite the disagreements that characterize what participants argue are their preferred policies and based on their different analysis, I think they do agree, regardless of their disagreements, that the approach that's currently in place, one that emphasizes engagement with China in the interest of cooperation where American and Chinese interests overlap, while hedging against the possibility that remaining conflicts may require the United States to push back more firmly against China where American interests require it, that this approach is now no longer adequate. Put otherwise, I think what many of the critics who otherwise disagree on their recommendations believe is that the approach that Jaume Calizalde once labeled engagement, this combination of elements of containment and engagement for dealing with China, simply no longer suffices. But if they don't think that approach suffices, the question is, what do they propose the United States should do? I think many of you in the room are probably aware of many of the writings that have been published recently, people weighing in with proposals, some of these from folks who I think probably have visions of appointment in the next administration dancing in their heads. But if I can oversimplify this debate a bit, it seems to me that in fact what we see are two broad perspectives now crystallizing. One is a perspective that sees a looming shift in the contours of international politics, specifically a historic shift in the global economic and military power relations that are accompanying China's ongoing ascent. In this perspective, there's a call for the United States to come up with a more creative and proactive way to cope with the trend that cannot be forestalled. Michael Swain, to my right, in his book America's Challenge, in his regular stream of articles in the China Leadership Monitor, and most recently in a piece in the journal Foreign Affairs, has become a key voice, thoughtfully staking out a position from this perspective. The other perspective sees China's ascent and the shift in the regional and perhaps global balance of power, economic and military power, as an outcome that can be forestalled. And it calls for crafting American policies that aim to prevent precisely the outcome that the other perspective sees as nearly inevitable, the need for the United States to somehow accommodate a stronger China. Ashley Tellis, sitting to my left, in his many writings on Asian security, but most visibly in his recent report for the Council on Foreign Relations, co-authored with Robert Blackwell, Revising U.S. Grand Strategy Toward China, has emerged as a key voice, thoughtfully articulating a position from this perspective. My role today is simply to serve as moderator, or maybe I should say I'm here as a couples counselor. And I say that because I do recall that Michael and Ashley once co-authored, in fact in the year 2000, a classic book interpreting China's grand strategy. Yet in the years since its publication, it seems their views have grown apart, to put it mildly. And I'm not exactly sure why. I can't offer any guarantee that this session today is going to bring them any closer to an intellectual reconciliation. But I can guarantee that we're in for a treat today, and in fact, I would argue that we'll be in for an even bigger treat to the extent that they continue to disagree. So, finally, a word about format. Looking at the time here, I think each of our presenters give 15 minutes, roughly 15 minutes of opening remarks, after which we'll turn it over to the audience for some questions and allow the speakers then to engage with one another after you raise some questions. So, we didn't agree on who would go first. Alphabetically, that would be Swain. Okay. You're up, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Avery. I really appreciate your coming and serving as moderator here. Thank you all for coming. I don't know how many of you have read or seen the recent essay that I wrote appeared in this issue of Foreign Affairs, and there's a longer version of it on the Carnegie website. But what I'm going to do today is give you essentially the gist of what that essay says, what the argument in it is. And it is, as Avery said, it's an argument about the need for the United States and the region as a whole, and by the region I mean in particular the Western Pacific, to transition towards what can otherwise, what would be called a balance of power, and a stable balance of power of some type. Because the situation in the Western Pacific has never been a real balance of power. It's been a situation that has largely existed under the influence of the United States as a predominant maritime power. So let me say I'm going to speak a little bit about why I think this is, the old situation is changing and why it's not sustainable, why I think that the alternatives in the way of response to a balance of power are also likely to prove more onerous than otherwise, and then outline what I mean by a balance of power, and end with a few points about the difficulties of getting to a balance of power, which I in no way, shape, or form would slight. So let me start by talking about the changes. The United States and China, in my view, hold very different notions about what is the best means of preserving prosperity and stability, both globally and in the Western Pacific in particular. The United States, as I said a minute ago, has long favored and has enjoyed, in fact, a position of predominance in the maritime realm. I'm not talking about continental Asia. We conducted 2 wars on the continent of Asia, and they both of them came out rather badly. The United States, I don't think, sees itself as a continental power able to exert influence on the Asian mainland. This is about the maritime sphere, and it's about the sphere within about approximately 1,500 nautical miles of China's coastline. In that area, since the Second World War, for the past 70 years, the United States has been second to none. It's been the predominant maritime power, right up to the 12 nautical mile limit of any particular nation in the area, including China. The Chinese, on the other hand, have never accepted this kind of situation. They've generally believed, particularly in the last 20 to 30 years, that the world is evolving in the direction of multipolar order, that there are more than one major powers on the planet, and that in the region itself there should be a balance of power of some kind that should emerge over time to provide them with their own security, but also to facilitate the continued economic growth that they think is essential regionally. Now, these 2 perspectives have existed for a long time, and they've never really come into conflict. And they haven't come into conflict because China has not had the capacity, nor has it had the motivation to actually challenge the American position. In fact, in some respects, during the Cold War period, in the latter years of the Cold War in particular, American maritime predominance in Asia was a benefit to the Chinese. It served to keep Japan in check. It served to keep other historical rivalries in check within the region. And it served to allow other countries to focus on economic growth and development. The United States provided public goods in the form of security of sea lanes. And for the Chinese, there wasn't much downside in this kind of a situation, given their own very limited capacities at the time. But what's happened is that China obviously has become a much more involved power, a power that has much more capacity overseas, it has greater interests, it has a greater capacity to defend those interests, and much of that has extended into the maritime realm. And this, in particular, has happened in Asia. And so a situation that in the past the Chinese were willing to accept and accede to, they are increasingly less willing to do so. They don't believe that American maritime predominance in the Western Pacific is something that will preserve long-term security for them and stability as well. Now, as Avery said, people who look at this dynamic and this changing situation have different responses to it. Some of them call for America to double down. And this, I think, is a version of what Ashley argues for. The United States should keep well ahead of the Chinese. That's the only way to maintain stability in Asia. So the United States has to increase its defense spending still more. It has to increase its presence in the Western Pacific. It has to constrain China in a variety of ways without, however, adopting a full-fledged containment policy of the kind we saw against the Soviet Union. The other side of the coin, on the what I would regard as more extreme side on the Chinese side, is that China no longer should adopt the kind of more passive or defensive policy, more accommodationist policy it has had in the past. It should become more assertive. Now, many people say China today is more assertive, but I'm saying that there are people in China who believe the current Chinese government is not assertive enough. China needs to be more assertive, needs to use its strengths to move more rapidly to defend its interests, its growing interests in the region. Now, both of these arguments, to some degree, tend to rely on the concept of rising powers and dominant powers. On the one side, the United States, dominant power, needs to resist the rising power. On the other side, the rising power needs to come into its own and establish its own situation. My argument is that this dynamic is really in many ways based upon both faulty theoretical and misleading historical interpretations of what powers must or must not do. There is nothing that preordains major powers, rising powers and status quo powers, to engage in hard power striving for dominance at all costs. And China, in particular, is not, in my view, historically predisposed to seek what I would call hard power dominance in the Asia-Pacific. I don't believe that China's historical record acts as a basis for making that kind of an argument, but even more importantly, I don't think that the historical record, going back to the pre-modern period, is a very good reference in any event to understand how China calculates its security interests today. I think the historical record provides a much more mixed and nuanced set of possible outcomes for a rising power and a stable or a status quo power. The real question is the issue of the bid for hegemony. It's not, would a power like to be a hegemonic power and control events? I think that probably goes without saying to most major powers. The question is, would the bid for hegemony make sense? Would it provide more security for a state or less security? And there I would say a historical record in the modern times clearly suggests it would be less security. Clearly suggests that an effort to rise, to make a bid for hegemony and displace a dominant power will lead to, in most cases, as it has in the recent past, failure. The United States was successful in this regard largely only because it had two very strong assets going for it. One, it was going up against a weak and democratic power that it had a certain amount of affinity with, Great Britain. Two, it did so from an environment of great passivity, where it had no threats around its immediate environment. China is engaged in a very, very different situation. It doesn't confront that kind of situation. It's much more complex, and it's much more challenging for the Chinese. I would also argue that neither China nor the United States require dominant influence in the Western Pacific to ensure their security and to ensure prosperity. Neither of them requires that the other side be subordinate in order to gain the benefits of a global international order. They can both benefit from that order under the existing conditions of the world today. So I would say that in general, you don't have a drive for dominance on the part of the Chinese, at least not yet. I think the Chinese could be led into this if the United States believes that the only possible solution for itself is to maintain its predominance, even in China's own backyard, up to its own 12 nautical mile limit. I think the Chinese then would begin to reconsider their strategy and their policy approach. Let me add a couple of other points, though, about why I think U.S. predominance is not that advisable. I'm not sure it's feasible. I think that the effort by the United States to try and stay as far ahead as the Chinese as it would need to stay in order to convey an unambiguous level of predominance that would be clear to all, including the Chinese, is highly unlikely. It's probably not going to be feasible, particularly within the area I'm talking about, 1,000 to 1,500 nautical miles from China's coastline. The Chinese will acquire capabilities that will be perceived to be able to challenge the United States in that area of the world. And that perception, even if the reality itself is not as clear, the perception of that will alter the way countries in the region think about security in the area. And if the United States tries to pursue that kind of alternative perception, I think it's, without the reality behind it, I think it's going to be highly, highly destabilizing. And even if the United States were able to do that, I don't think the Chinese would accept it. I think the Chinese would continue to acquire capabilities that would, in essence, condemn us to a Cold War in the region. And we engage in a security competition that would be far more intense than we've seen today. Now, one way out of this, of course, for a lot of people, is to talk about China's economic collapse. Well, we don't have to worry about this because the Chinese aren't going to go anywhere. They're not going to rise to the occasion. I basically just don't accept this argument. I don't think the Chinese economy is going to collapse. I don't think the Chinese are going to be down to such a low level of growth that they will suffer domestic instability of such a severe nature that it would lead them to really curtail, to a major degree, their capabilities and their capacities overseas. But I think more, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but what I would say is that if the United States bases its strategy on the notion that the Chinese will eventually decline and collapse, they will have lost the opportunity. The United States will have delayed a decision in transitioning to a stable balance and make it far more difficult in the future because they would anticipate a collapse that if it doesn't occur, is going to make it much more difficult. So, given all these dynamics, what do I conclude from this? Well, I conclude basically that the only reasonable, optimal solution for the United States and China is to transition towards a stable balance of power in the Western Pacific. Not across the world, not globally, we're talking the Western Pacific, in which the vital interests of both sides are protected and neither side enjoys the clear capacity to dominate the other militarily within, at the very least, the first island chain, so-called. That is to say, 300 to 400 nautical miles off the Chinese coast, if not further, out to 1,000 nautical miles. That would encompass Japan, Korea, Taiwan, all of these critical issues are within this area. I think that's the area that we'll need to have, in essence, establish a de facto balance of power. Now, what would this require? I think it would require the implementation of a series of CBMs that are far more far-reaching than they are today, with expectations of reciprocal behavior that would be based upon a clear understanding about how one might proceed to engage in this kind of behavior. Now, many people have written about this. They've written about the need for some CBMs of various types that go beyond what we have today. Jim Steinberg and Michael O'Hanlon recently wrote a book on this subject, where they advocated a lot of these types of CBMs. Lyle Goldstein, who just spoke yesterday at Brookings, offers a whole series of what he calls cooperative spirals of different types of interactions that the US and China could be involved in that would lead to greater levels of cooperation between the two countries. I think these are all good. They're fine as a starting point in some respects, but I think they're insufficient. Because if you're going to transition to anything resembling a stable balance of power, you have to deal with the problem of adjusting and anticipating shifts in relative power. And that leads countries to test resolve, whether or not the other side is willing to do this, whether or not this side has the strength to do that. In order to make that a more balanced or more stable situation, you've got to reduce the propensity for various types of triggers in the region to precipitate confrontation between the United States and China as a more balanced set of relationships. What does that mean? That means, in my view, in essence, you have to establish what is in effect a de facto buffer zone within this area. That is a zone where neither side has dominance, as I said a minute ago, and neither side can use it to project power, but it serves as a basis for reassurance on a certain level of security in the region that one's own vital interests will not be threatened. Now, what does this look like? What it means is you need to have a unified and largely neutral Korean peninsula. You need to have a Korea that, although it might have some nominal association with the United States, would have no foreign forces on the peninsula, and it would have an effect of foreign policy that is a good neighbor policy with both the Chinese and the Americans. Getting to that situation, of course, is a complex issue and a difficult one, but I don't think it's an impossible one, given the larger strategic design that one would hope to put in place. The second element of this would be a demilitarized Taiwan, in which there is an understanding between the United States and China about arms sales on the one hand and specific types of military deployments by the Chinese on the other hand. This also faces some very significant obstacles. Many of them are political, and many of them are domestic. But I don't see them as being insurmountable. The third is in the area of maritime disputes. I think there has to be a reassessment on both sides about the saliency and the importance to vital interests of these disputes. For the United States, I think there has to be a clear definition of the bottom line for the United States, which is a less expansive line that it is currently taking in some respects in dealing with these disputes. It has to be focused very much on certain very fundamental issues like use of force, like freedom of navigation, and nothing else. That, again, is an issue that I think would require a certain amount of understanding over time, but I'm prepared to talk more about that. Regarding Japan, people say, well, how do you establish this kind of an area if the Japanese are right there? This would really rattle the Japanese. It would make them insecure. Well, I don't think this kind of a transition to a stable balance in this area could occur without some level of strengthening of the U.S.-Japan alliance. Either that or Japan will go independent. And I don't think that a independent Japanese security posture would necessarily benefit the region. People make arguments that it's the only option for the long term, but I don't think that's correct. I think Japan and the United States can establish a relationship that has a strong alliance, but still a very limited alliance, particularly in terms of the functions that Japan would perform in the Western Pacific beyond defense of the home islands and nearby waters. And I think that kind of a strengthening could be acceptable to the Chinese in the context of these other initiatives that I'm talking about. And then finally, I would say that in terms of force posture, what the United States and China need to transition towards is something that approximates what I call a mutual denial strategy. That is to say that both countries have the capacity to raise the stakes or the costs of the other side from engaging in some very extreme actions, use of direct force, attempt to forcibly seize areas and hold them, etc. They would be able to pose a sufficient level of deterrence to doing that. This does not require predominant military capability. It requires a very capable, largely defensive-oriented posture within that area. That's why it's called mutual denial. This argument has been made by people at the Navy War College and in other areas as an alternative to the past position of offensive-based military doctrine, which is the core of what the United States doctrine is today, in this part of the world at least. Now, before I end, let me just say a couple of words about the obstacles to this. As you can obviously see, there are many obstacles to this kind of a concept. This is not a grand bargain. This is not something that the United States and China can sit around a table and make a decision on and start moving the chess pieces. This is an issue that is going to have to be developed over time as an incremental process and beginning within the countries concerned. There needs to be a serious debate within the United States government and within the Chinese government about exactly what the benefits and costs would be of maintaining predominance on the U.S. side or on the Chinese side, trying to in any way achieve that, or trying to achieve something less than a buffer zone in the Western Pacific. And there needs to be a very clear understanding about if there is a need to transition to something else, then how do you go about doing that? Because it has to occur domestically in this country first. In the United States, as Avery suggested, the reflexive response is predominance. The reflexive response is we need to strengthen our position yet further. Many people interpret the rebalance as being exactly that. I don't see the rebalance as necessarily being that. I don't think that the United States, as I've just said, has to commit itself to that kind of what I regard as fruitless objective. I think there needs to be more consideration of the real alternatives. And that sort of discussion, I think, is long overdue within the United States. Within China, I think there needs to be also a very strong discussion about how the Chinese government expects to deal with the forces of nationalism over time. Because as China grows and becomes stronger, some of the forces of nationalism within China are going to become more insistent on certain types of behavior. And the Chinese government has to establish a policy where it can defuse, to the extent possible, these kinds of maritime disputes and other issues that serve as such a ready means of fueling this kind of ultranationalist sentiment within China. The Chinese government has no strategic interest in getting into fights with the Japanese over rocks. It doesn't serve the interests of the Chinese government. It doesn't serve the interests of the Japanese government. And the same thing could be held to be true in the South China Sea as well. So I think if there is an alternative in looking towards the future, and that this is understood as a possible alternative, then the pressures for these kinds of domestic nationalistic objectives, I think, can be addressed more effectively. And that's the sort of thing that I'm trying to recommend through this essay, and I will stop there. Thank you very much, Avery.
Thanks, Michael. So our next speaker is Ashley Tellis, and Michael stayed within the 15-minute restriction, if by 15 minutes you mean 20 minutes. So, so you have up to 20 minutes.
Don't tell me
15
that.
would be appreciated.
25.
I always follow the example of my fearless leader, so I'll be happy. I'll try and stay within 15 minutes. It's always a pleasure to have a discussion with Michael because I have the highest respect for his intellectual integrity, and I'm not saying this simply because we happen to be on the same stage here, but I've known Michael for close to 25 years now, and I appreciate the clarity with which he makes his arguments and his willingness to listen to the counterpoint. What I'm going to do this afternoon is address three questions. First, what is the strategic problem as I see it? The second is, why is predominance so critical to achieving American strategic aims in Asia? And then the third is, what's wrong with Michael, or more precisely, what's wrong with Michael's solution of creating a buffer zone up to the first island chain? So let me start with the first question. What is the strategic problem as I see it? The strategic problem as I see it is something like this. Thanks to China's being embedded in the liberal economic order in the last 30 years, China has grown dramatically across multiple indices of capability. If this growth was restricted purely to the economic, it might have caused anxieties, but I do not think it would have caused alarm. Because China's growth has moved beyond the economic into fundamental dimensions of military capability, it has raised alarm in East Asia, primarily on the part of the countries that abut China in the maritime periphery. Now, because many of these countries happen to be allied with the United States and look to the United States essentially for protection, the challenge that China poses through its advancing military capability becomes not simply a challenge to these countries on the periphery, but rather to the US alliance system in Asia. Because threats to these peripheral countries automatically stress the coupling between the United States and the countries that it seeks to protect. And so the heart of the security problem that I see in Asia today is one where growing Chinese power forces the smaller countries to become even more reliant on the United States for the kind of security protections that they seek in order to preserve their own security and their own autonomy in the face of this gradually growing and expanding China. And by expanding, I don't mean in a territorial sense, but in a political sense. So essentially what you have is growing Chinese power, causing anxiety in the periphery, and the periphery then relying even more on the United States for security guarantees in order to protect these peripheral states in the face of Chinese power. That's the essence of the strategic problem. Now, why is predominance critical in this context? Predominance is critical in this context because if the peripheral states can be assured that no matter what capabilities China acquires, the United States still has the wherewithal to satisfactorily and successfully come to their defense, then the security problem, which I just described, begins to get attenuated. So the heart of the contradiction is essentially an objective one. If the regional states begin to fear that US power projection capabilities are not keeping pace with China's coercive capabilities, then essentially extended deterrence becomes less and less credible. The regional states cannot continue to rely on the United States for their defense, and therefore could be tempted to go in different directions, many of which do not advance American interest. Now, there are two ways, obviously, to deal with this problem. One way to deal with this problem is simply to change the fundamental structure of political relations in the Indo-Pacific region in a way that Michael described. So, for example, if you can get the Taiwanese to forget about any aspirations they might have for independence, or if you can get a unified Korea to basically say, we're going to be more or less neutral, or if you can get the Japanese to say, oh, growing Chinese power is not really a challenge to us because the United States essentially is robust enough, the relationship between the United States and Japan is robust enough, then essentially what you've done is you've removed the strategic problem, deus ex machina. And I have no problems with that. So if Michael wants to go out and pursue the agenda of actually, moving to that very ambitious set of goals that he has outlined, by all means, we should take a crack at it. But to be very honest, I am not confident that we will be able to solve the problem by that fundamental restructuring of the political environment, which in a sense takes the problem away deus ex machina. Now, if the problem is not going to be taken away in the form that Michael has described, then the United States is still left with a strategic issue. And that strategic issue is, how does it make good on its extended deterrence guarantees to a whole slew of friends and allies in the Indo-Pacific region? If that is the challenge that the United States is going to face for the foreseeable future, because many of the solutions that Michael has advocated are solutions that are going to be possible, if they are at all possible, only in the far, far term, we still have a near-term problem. And the near-term problem is, how do I make credible my security, my extended security guarantees? So, what's the answer to that problem? The answer to that problem, in my mind, is very clearly maintaining America's strategic, military, and geopolitical predominance. And the answer is predominance because the alternative of solving the extended deterrence challenge through the balance that Michael advocates begins to look very closely and very quickly like weakness. And if the region is not convinced that the balance that Michael advocates actually advances their own security and autonomy, then the extended deterrence challenge that we have to meet is one that we're going to fail. So to my mind, the reason for pursuing predominance is not because Americans have a fixation with predominance. I mean, we may have a fixation with predominance, but then, we have to meet the psychotherapist who sits between us for private consultations later, right? For the moment, the real issue with predominance is not because it is an outgrowth of our psychology, but the real advantage of predominance is that it allows you to make your extended deterrence guarantees more credible. That is, predominance allows you to come to the rescue of our allies at lower cost to ourselves. And because it allows you to come to the allies' assistance at lower cost to ourselves, the allies have incentives to believe that American extended deterrence guarantees are in fact credible. So that's the strategic logic for actually having predominance. Now let me make two other points about predominance. First, predominance is not as costly as I believe Michael makes it out to be. First, the United States has an enormous power advantage over China where comprehensive national power is concerned. I think it is really a myth to think of China as being a genuine peer competitor of the United States. No matter how powerful China has become in the last 30 years, and that's very clearly true, China has become capable. it is not a peer competitor of the United States. There is still a vast gap between the two countries in terms of raw economic capability, in terms of our capacity to mobilize allies and friends around the world, our ability to dominate international institutions and the construction of global rulemaking, and finally, in terms of military power. US military power still is head and shoulders above what China can muster, even in the Western Pacific, even in the area that is of most interest to Michael. So my point is, when it comes to being able to maintain predominance, it is not as difficult a task as people often believe. And I do not think preserving American predominance, for example, requires an expansion in our defense budget. What it does require is a willingness to confront what are weaknesses in the way that the budget is structured. And it certainly requires us to think of a different kind of force architecture in dealing with the Chinese challenge, but it does not require us to double or even increase our defense budget very much more beyond the levels that we already have. Let me make one other point on predominance. Michael's argument about predominance being costly is hinged fundamentally to the fact that somehow Chinese anti-access and area denial capabilities are so robust that to defeat them, we essentially have to break the bank. Now, my argument is this. Anti-access and area denial is not a new challenge for the United States, lest people think it is. We dealt with very robust anti-access and area denial that the Soviet Union mounted for close to 30 years in terms of our ability to reinforce our defenses in Europe. We know how to deal with anti-access and area denial. And the Chinese, because they have a few more gadgets like the DF-21D, the so-called carrier missile killer, et cetera, it doesn't change the fundamental nature of the game. And I can talk to you in greater detail about how you can defeat anti-access area denial in the Q&A. But my bottom line is this. The Chinese can certainly raise the costs to our military operations, but there is no inevitability that their investments in anti-access and area denial will rule the day. So we can still counter these capabilities while still remaining within the broad parameters of our defense capability. Let me go quickly to the third and last question that I promised I would answer, which is, why is Michael's solution of creating a de facto buffer zone between China and the first island chain not persuasive enough to me? Let me start with the first point that I made earlier. It is going to be extremely difficult to create such a buffer zone because it hinges fundamentally on having major structural changes in the character of political relations in key countries along the periphery. And to my mind, it is much easier to defeat Chinese anti-access and area denial than it is to convince a unified Korea to have a neutralist position, or to reassure Japan that a United States that will not have predominance will actually be an effective security guarantor. So when you weigh the challenges that are involved in Michael's solution, the challenges I see are extremely exorbitant in the costs and in the implementation obstacles. In comparison, defeating A2AD almost looks like a simple proposition. So that's point number one. Point number two, it's very hard to enforce the kind of buffer zone that Michael imagines, because at the end of the day, the ability to make that solution stick is simply a function of the relative capabilities of China and the United States. If China really begins to grow in capabilities over time, explain to me why a China of this kind would be satisfied with a buffer zone when the alternative is that it could have it all. Now, you could make the argument that the Chinese, being far-sighted, would say, oh my God, if the alternative to the buffer zone is a conflict with the United States, then maybe the buffer zone is, in our interest. And if that is true, that's wonderful. But if you look at the record of rising states over the last 500 years, there have been very few instances that I've seen where rising states have actually foregone the opportunities for short-term gains simply because there are actually long-term payoffs from having a more conservative political strategy. Now, if the Chinese actually do this, they would be the first, in a 500-year cycle. And, I'd certainly welcome that. But, I'm sufficiently old-fashioned in my expectations of countries and their political behaviors to somehow imagine that the Chinese would be different from the patterns established in the past. The third point that I want to make is for Michael's suggestion of a buffer zone to actually stick. Because it's not enough to simply create the buffer zone. You have to make certain that the buffer zone actually endures over a long period of time. What you need to have is actually, in technical terms, a defense-dominant environment. That is, the costs of defense have to be much less than the costs of offense, right? If you have a defense-dominant technical system, yes, a buffer zone becomes viable because then it just doesn't make sense to pursue offensive strategies because the offensive strategies will inevitably fail because the defense is stronger than the offense. Today, and for the foreseeable future, I cannot convince myself that we are on the cusp of a defense-dominant military technical revolution. So it is entirely possible that technologies that make offense more viable will actually rule the day. And I'll give you a very simple example. Today, it is far easier to build a missile force that can penetrate a missile defense system than it is to build a robust missile defense system that can actually defeat offensive missiles. Now, if you end up in an environment where the offense has the advantage, as I described, missile forces being able to overwhelm a defensive system, then a buffer zone that relies essentially on mutual denial is simply going to prove to be less and less attractive over time. The final point. Why should the United States today sacrifice the superiority that it has in anticipation of the fact that China may, over a period of time, be able to negate its superiority? I mean, maybe there will come a point, 10, 15, 20 years from now, where the Chinese might be able to negate our superiority. If that is true, my view is we'll make the adjustments 15 or 20 years down the line. Why should I be making preemptive adjustments in the anticipation of a rising China? A lot can happen between now and a China of the next 15 years. So my argument would be, as long as the United States can, with the power at its disposal, build the capabilities to sustain predominance in the Western Pacific, it ought to sustain that predominance. And if there comes a point where the costs of maintaining predominance are so prohibitive, then I imagine that any rational state, of which the United States is certainly one, would come back and do the arithmetic all over again and make its judgment. But today, I do not see the cost-benefit ratio being such that the United States really has to rush to the barricades to figure out how it has to adjust potentially to some, Chinese capabilities that may or may not materialize sometime in the future. So as far as I'm concerned, predominance is a very good strategy for the United States for a good while longer. And when I look at the character of the American economy, and I look at the revolutionary transformations that are currently underway in this economy, for example, in energy, in transportation, in materials and manufacturing, in defense, I am actually convinced that the United States will be able to sustain military preponderance in the Western Pacific for as long as the eye can see. And I would actually be shocked if we lost our predominance in the time frame that Michael is thinking about, in a way that would cause us to actually revisit our strategy in the way that he suggests. So I'm going to end on that note, and I'm looking forward to.
Well, thanks to both of you. We're going to open it up to questions. But speaking of the revolutionary changes in the American transportation sector, I had to take Amtrak down here this morning. And so I'm going to take advantage of my position here as the moderator to open the questioning because, I paid the price here. So I want to pose a question to both of you first, which is something you didn't talk about, but I think has to be somewhere in your analysis and your policy recommendations. Because you both talked a lot about power, shifting power, or avoiding a shift in power, predominance or balance. You also offered recommendations focusing on a process of building up confidence-building measures or bolstering extended deterrence. But neither of you really made clear to me what are the interests at stake? What are China's vital interests? What are America's vital interests in the area you're focused on? Is it possible to determine which of these interests on each side should be viewed as legitimate? Because you're both talking about a part of the world that's not the territorial and political integrity of the homeland. You're talking about things outside their borders. How do we sort this out, what the vital interests are? And by vital interests, I mean things that both parties are really willing to run some serious risks over, including the risk of military conflict. And once you've told us how you view American interests and Chinese interests in this region, are they inherently incompatible? And if so, why? If not, why not? I just finished grading final exams, so that's not and so, Michael, since you got to go first last time, actually, I'll let you go first.
Okay. I'll take a crack at the vital interest question. To my mind, since the end of the Second World War, the U.S. has had one very critical interest in Eurasia. And that is to prevent the rise of a regional hegemon in Europe and to prevent the rise of a regional hegemon in Asia. We fought a long Cold War with the Soviet Union to prevent the rise of a regional hegemony in Europe. I imagine we should be willing to do as much, if required, to prevent the rise of a regional hegemony in Asia. Now, Michael can make the argument with cogency that China has no intention of becoming a regional hegemon. If so, it solves my problem. But I have a sneaking feeling that China's choices in this regard may not be simply a matter of volition. That if China's power actually grows, it may be compelled, despite itself, to exhibit, shall we say, hegemonic tendencies. And because I don't know whether China might go in that direction, I think it is in American interest to make certain that China never gets to the point where it begins to entertain the possibility that hegemonic control or hegemonic influence might be within reach. And so my obsession with preponderance is linked to the objective of creating as wide a gap between US power and Chinese power as possible. So that even if China begins to sort of distend in capabilities over time, it never reaches the point where a grasp for hegemony ever becomes viable or within reach.
Michael?
Well, I would agree with Ashley that I think that neither the United States nor China want to see the region dominated by a hostile power. I mean, in a sense, that will become, if it is not China's objective as well. Why? I mean, you have to ask. I mean, that's not a self-referential problem. The issue is why. Well, the presumption is that because such a power would act to undermine the other power. In this particular case, I think China and the United States have the same level of high commitment to a region that is stable and prosperous on the basis of essentially an open market system across the region. Neither country has an interest in establishing an exclusionary sphere of influence within Asia. I think people who suggest that that's China's objective base it on nothing other than some kind of straight line projection of what they think a hegemonic China would want to see, which I think is essentially divorced from the reality of the way the world is operating today. So for me, the solution is not, is American predominance the only solution? It's what is the best way to maintain stability and prosperity? If you do believe, as I do, that China's capability is not going to flag to the level where it simply acquiesces in a dominant U.S., and much of this argument revolves precisely around that question. But if the Chinese have the capacity to develop a capability that they believe is necessary to prevent the United States from constraining themselves, it's a classic security dilemma. And for me, the solution to this dilemma, if China is going to continue to grow and expand and have greater capability and capacity, is not to dominate China, which will be a guarantee for a Cold War in Asia, which I think will be inevitably the result of what Ashley is saying. The alternative is to establish some level of understanding about what in fact the interests are, and I do not think they fundamentally conflict. They're both in the same type of ultimate regional environment. The question is, what kind of system will best maintain that and not lead to the dedication of growing numbers of resources into military developments, which I think will be the outcome of what Ashley's talking about. The other issue I'd like to address is the whole question that Ashley began with, which is the question of allied expectations, because this is so often raised. Well, we have to do this because the Allies demand it. Well, what are we talking about when we're talking about American allies? The most critical ally is Japan in Asia. There is no more important ally than the Japanese. And as I've said, I don't believe that we need to say that it is ipso facto inevitably the case that Japan will regard its only possible way of ensuring its security that the United States dominates China. Because the assessment will be at what cost? What will be the consequences of doing that for Japan itself, which itself is the most dependent on China economically, more than any other power? So you have to think about what the consequences would be of trying to pursue the kind of strategy that Ashley's talking about. And if you're not convinced that either if you're convinced that the United States will easily be able to maintain its predominance, and B, the Chinese essentially won't do much about it that will matter, then I'd say, fine. But I think both of those are highly questionable.
Okay, thanks. You've been a very patient audience. We have microphones roaming around somewhere, so I will call on, I'll begin with Stapleton Roy up here in the front, and there's a microphone coming up from behind.
Thank you both for stimulating presentations. I'm not comfortable with the emphasis on dominance. And I wonder whether it's necessary to the issue that we're addressing, which really is the question, how does the United States define its relationship with China? It would seem to me if you put the issue differently, which is that the goal of the United States should not be dominance in order to prevent a potentially hostile power from dominating the region, but rather responsible behavior, then you come to a whole different set of conclusions about how you should be dealing with each other. I'm uncomfortable with dominance for two reasons. One is American political theory, which is the basis for all modern political systems, is that you don't want concentrations of power because that inevitably leads to abuse of power. And we have seen at a period of American dominance that we fought wars in the Middle East, which some people don't think were necessary wars for us to fight. And the reason was because there was no power opposing us, such as we had during the Cold War. And therefore, we could kind of arbitrarily use our power. The second issue is, does it require American dominance to keep China from dominating East Asia? we were not able to dominate the Western Hemisphere the way that we originally had conceived under the Monroe Doctrine. We couldn't keep the Russians from establishing a foothold in Cuba at the height of our power in the Western Hemisphere. So with the China surrounded by India and Russia and Japan and Korea, Vietnam, and the United States as a permanent player in East Asia, it seems to me the risk of dominance of East Asia by any power, let alone China, is small. So the real question is, countries ought to be able to rise and improve themselves and benefit their people if they behave responsibly and if they abide by whatever the rules are of the international system. And then in a sense, the United States' goal should be a wealthy, prosperous China that plays by international rules, is responsible in its behavior, and that would meet US requirements. The dominance concept could be applied to South Asia, it could be applied to South America, where we should be concerned about Brazil dominating the region, et cetera. And I don't see our psychology as thinking that way. So in other words, I would like to frame the issue from a fundamentally different standpoint. Dominance should not be an end in itself, and it perhaps is not the best means to ensure responsible behavior, because it's important for us to behave responsibly, and I'm not confident that a dominant United States behaves responsibly based on recent
I think that's
history.
the key.
I gather that's mainly targeting you.
Well, let me, thank you, Steve. Always a pleasure to see you. Let me answer the last remark that you made. To my mind, an irresponsibly dominant United States is still better than a responsible but weak United States. Because to my mind, if there is fundamental American weakness, then whether we are responsible or not will be completely irrelevant, right?
I was not arguing for American weakness.
Right. But the point is, there is a foundation on which we ought to pursue your goal of responsible behavior. To my mind, the best way to induce countries to behave responsibly is what Teddy Roosevelt understood over 100 years ago, which is you behave politely, but you carry a big stick, right? And so if your complaint is that we have abused and misused your power, I'm willing to plead guilty to the charge. But to my mind, keeping the American economy, keeping the American sword in good repair is really fundamental to inducing the kind of responsible behavior that you argue for. The second point I would make, and it goes to something that Michael said earlier, you know, the way China sees itself and its own behavior is fundamentally different today from how the region sees China. And that's what is at the heart of the problem. That the region today sees China as overbearing, muscular and assertive, and therefore increases demands on the United States essentially for reassurance. And then the question really becomes, if we are faced with those demands, does a preponderance of power allow us to make our extended deterrence more credible or less? Or can we credibly service our extended deterrence obligations even with lesser preponderance? I mean, to my mind, the question is answered very simply, that more power gives you more flexibility, it gives you greater autonomy, and if it ever comes to a serious conflict, then obviously you have many advantages that redound to your benefit.
Take the question up front here.
Atul Singh, I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer that was born when I came out of the University of Pennsylvania. So Avery might remember me, and of course, it's good to meet Ashley, an old friend who invited me. So here's, let me simplify. Since I now live in California, let me do it a la California style. So Ashley's argument is there are damsels in distress all around China's shores. And the knight in shining armor, the resplendent, chivalrous and muscular United States should ride, or in this case, should sail to the rescue of these damsels, come what may. And just as at the end of the Second World War, the US was willing to do what it takes to stand up to the USSR, so it should do the same with the Middle Kingdom. Now, two things here. First, that thought led to 1953 and the fantastic coup, of which the consequences are alive today. It led to numerous other disasters. It led to numerous other disasters which were ideological in nature. So that to me is an ideological fixation that's a wrong place to begin. But more importantly, at that point, Ashley, the US had 50% of the world GDP. It had the Bretton Woods system. The rules of the game were decided by the US, as they are to a lesser degree today. And now you have the AIDB and the BRICS Bank precisely because the Congress is not going to pass the reforms the US government itself is pleading it to do, right? So there's been an institutional decay and a lack of imagination. And so what we are seeing is, first, an ideological red herring, which might lead to dangerous implications, and two, a diminishing of economic capability, because the US is now 25% of the world GDP, and three, the institutional decay within the US itself. Now, when you say it will not cost us more, you assume that the institutions here have the imagination to function in a more robust manner and come up with cheap alternatives. Now, I don't see these prerequisites. Yes, what you say is fantastic if the US can do it, but I don't think it's possible. So as a relatively declining power, it'll have to give way, and the Chinese will have to behave a little more maturely. I don't agree entirely with what you said that, you can have Korea unified and demilitarized Taiwan and Japan asserting. I think Japan's demography makes it impossible for it to assert itself in the long term. And so I think the situation is complex and messy, and these theories do not hold.
Does that require a response? Well,
Well, it's a simple yes or no question.
no. No.
Don't beat around the bush, Ashley.
No, I'll address two points you made. First, the fact that US GDP has declined from 50% to 25% is completely understandable. Because when you compare US GDP at the end of World War II, where you had half the world in ruins, the fact that we had half the world's GDP was a completely unnatural phenomenon. If you look at the stability, in fact, for me, the fascinating thing is the stability of the relative American share of global GDP, even with the rise of great powers, right? I mean, it's not that we haven't lost a percentage point here or haven't gained a percentage point there, but by and large, there has been a stability with respect to US relative shares, which have hovered between 20 and 25%. So that's one point to keep in mind. Second, I have no problem with the fact that we should not accommodate China in different ways, including in global institutions. We should find ways of doing that. And we've been somewhat silly in the way that we've managed, recent things like the AIIB and so on and so forth. But, I wouldn't get excessively pessimistic about institutional decay in the United States. Because if you look at institutional decay in many of the other countries that you're talking about, including in China, where the problem is not decay, but institutional brittleness, right? All of a sudden, the United States looks like heaven in comparison. So, many of the contenders that we are talking about also have very serious challenges, which I think we ought to factor into the equation.
Right there.
It's a question for Mr. Swain, and I'll try to pose it neutrally because it's in fact a neutral question. I'm Mark Tokel from the Korea Economic Institute. I'd like to get back to the definition of vital interest. Is it a legitimate vital interest of China's to be able to influence or veto the behavior of countries around its borders? There are people who believe it's a legitimate interest for Russia to be able to ensure that Ukraine does not join NATO or the EU, and we'd be better off to accommodate that. Should we accommodate China in the same way?
Well, if you put it in zero-sum terms like that anything the Chinese would want to see done would, so you really have to get down to the specifics of what you're talking about. I certainly think the Chinese should have the capacity to play a role in the region such that other powers around its periphery pay very close attention to what China's interests are. Now, the devil is in the detail there. What does that mean to say that? Now, if China's definition of its interests are you need to become a satellite of China. They want to have Japan become a satellite of China. They want to have Korea become a satellite of China. Then obviously that's not going to be a welcome or acceptable option. The question is how China itself defines its interests in this particular instance. And there I do think, as I've said in my comments, that I don't believe the Chinese necessarily view this as a zero-sum situation. I do think that they want to see deference to some level from countries around their periphery. That doesn't mean subjugation. That does mean a lot of economic intercourse and a hell of a lot of economic benefit for the countries involved as well as for the Chinese. The question is, does that involve that these countries must acquire, say, the presence of foreign militaries, the presence of the United States with basing and other aspects in these countries all along the periphery? Well, then I'd say that's a problem. I don't think that's the United States' objective, and I certainly hope that that's not what the United States thinks is necessary in order to maintain some stability in the region.
Is this a follow-up question on that? Yes, you.
I respectfully disagree
Microphone.
with you said. I
Can you say-
think
can you say who you are?
Chinese
Can you
have.
identify yourself, sir?
I'm Willie. Okay. Navy. I work for Navy. Chinese have long history that there's only one sun in the sky, especially in their backyard. So I think in like a diplomatic term, they may say some stable balance is their goal. But if you ask really inside their mind, either Chinese dominance or like a U.S. dominance, either way, I think there is no stable balance. And also, I have one question about your comment. If you look at the defense budget of U.S. and China, especially in terms of PPP, right now it's about China's defense budget is half that of U.S. Maybe in 2020, it will be almost same. And especially in this kind of like military business, home game and also away game make a hell of difference. Some people said to make some kind of balance, it costs 16-1. Okay, away play costs 16 times more. So our DoD budget really like a stable, flat. How we can achieve like a U.S. dominance?
Okay, sounded to me like that was actually two questions. One for Michael about the historical resonance for China and this belief that from China's perspective there can only be one dominant power, not shared power. And for Ashley, the question of really whether it's affordable for the United States to get engaged in a competition in military expenditures with China. So, Michael.
Well, I dealt with this in some respects in my comments, my remarks, but I mean, we looked actually at the historical record in some detail when Ashley and I wrote a book on Chinese grand strategy. And at that time, I mean, what I understood about China's behavior was that it often sought to stabilize its periphery. How did it do that? It did it in a whole variety of different ways. Oftentimes it did it through the establishment of relationships that were reassuring in both directions, that involved economic benefit in both directions, particularly with regard to the peripheral state, but some level of deference. The Chinese regarded their singular position in the region as one that wasn't essentially military in nature. It was essentially based upon the attraction of their culture, the attraction of their history, the attraction of their economic power and capability. There were some arguments about military capabilities as well, but I wouldn't say that they were front and center, that they were predominant. There was a lot of question. I think if you look at current Chinese behavior and recent history for China, I think the biggest issue is not China's notion that it should be the dominant power in Asia. The biggest issue for China is its experience during the later 19th and early 20th century. the experience with colonialism and the experience with foreign countries and the depredations of those countries on China. I think that has created, in my view, an unhealthy, rear-looking, past-looking attitude in the recent past among many Chinese that makes them, in some respects, excessively dependent upon China exercising its rights, if you will. And that is precisely the kind of thing that I think needs to be redefined to a great extent within China. And it can be done. I think a China that is stronger, is more capable, has more confidence in itself and in its environment, is not necessarily a China that is going to resort to the kind of aggressive behavior that some people think it will as a stronger power. I think it depends enormously on how it calculates its environment and its leverage and its capabilities. So, I'm not as willing as some people are to throw out the window arguments that people make about China's desire to dominate, China's desire to have balance in the region. I think it recognizes what the environment is that it's operating under, which is very, very different.
Oh, the difference between the home game and the away game. This is not new for the United States. We dealt with this throughout the Cold War, where the bulk of our military focus was on the away game. And we've created essentially a global support system to be able to back our military operations in the away game. Our military budgets are designed to deal with the away game. Until very recently, we never thought about homeland security as actually stressing the defense budget, something we even had to think about. So the entire focus of the United States is that of a global expeditionary power. So in some sense, this is a natural consequence of what we've been doing for the last 60 years. So I don't see this as being, inordinately stressful or something that we don't have experience in dealing with. If you look at the way our Air Force, if you look at the way our Navy, and even, the US Army now, more and more, it's focused fundamentally on dealing with the away games. And so I don't see this as being something, that we have to go back to scratch to try to figure out. We have the capacity to do it. And as I said, the issue is not budgets. And first, I have real problems with PPP comparisons because, they're among the most fraudulent sort of devices you can conjure to kind of force relationships that are not really there. But leave that aside. With $600 billion, we outpace, most countries in defense spending. Where we have a problem is with the internal allocations of that budget. And therefore, if we begin to do two things carefully, one is to look at internal allocations, especially issues relating to personnel costs, medical, so on and so forth. And if we look at force structure changes, we can maintain the kind of predominance that we have enjoyed up to this point within the top numbers of the defense budget as we've known them.
Let's try to get a question from this side, in the back, all the way in the back.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Royal. I'm with Decisive Analytics Corporation. This is for Michael Swain. I wanted you to clarify a bit more about your statements about our allies. You talked about clarifying what our vital interests are in the Eastern China Sea and keeping it only to freedom of navigation as well as use of force. And you also highlighted the importance of Japan as an ally. But the problem is we have a number of allies in the region, including ones that are weaker and who have conflicts with China, such as the Philippines and Thailand. So I was wondering how you would address existing alliance we have with them and our alliance commitments. Thanks.
Well, in the case of the Korean Peninsula, I've already addressed that issue, and I think that alliance ultimately is going to have to be revised considerably, if not done away with, ultimately. As far as other alliances in the region are concerned, the alliance with Australia, I don't think is one that will in any way pose a problem. In fact, in many ways, it's a benefit for the United States. But I don't see it as a central issue in what I'm talking about in this area of the Western Pacific. I think the alliance with the Philippines is something that will depend very much on how the United States and China deal with this larger strategic problem within that area, because the Philippines does fall within this area. And for the Philippines, it could become a situation where they would benefit from having a position that is not as closely tied to the United States, but one where this territorial dispute, which is essentially the basis for the conflict between themselves and the Chinese in the South China Sea, that is going to be the key to dealing with that issue for the Philippines. The Philippines has not been, in recent history, a huge proponent of a close alliance with the United States. But it's become more so, as Ashley points out, because of its concerns about Chinese behavior in the South China Sea. If you can address that issue more effectively, I think the concerns that the Philippines has about its larger security environment will be more manageable. So I think the interlocking nature of these issues is very important to understand. It's not just a simple question of what do we do with the Philippines. It's a question of what context are you going to operate within to develop what kind of longer-term future, and how does the alliance function in that regard. The alliances that the United States has are not self-justifying entities. They're there for a reason. They exist to serve the interests of both the ally and the United States. But from an American perspective, first and foremost, they're there to serve the interests of the United States. If the interests of the United States suggest that those alliances need to be modified, then I don't see how the views of the ally itself should be the predominant characteristic or consideration for how you go about adjusting those alliances. Now, that is by no means an argument in favor of throwing the alliances out the window, but it is about seriously assessing the function of a particular kind of an alliance for a particular type of security in the region. And that's what I think needs to be done. If there's going to be an effective way of dealing with the changing power reality in the region, there has to be a desire, an open-minded and a hard-headed approach to how the United States goes about serving its interests over the long term.
Mike?
Hi, Mike McDevitt from CNA. I want to return to the home game and away game for a moment. You're right, Ashley, we did play the home game during the entire Cold War, but arguably, the away game in the entire during the Cold War, arguably the away game in the Pacific was pretty easy. It was not very easy in Europe. And for many decades in Europe, we depended upon nuclear weapons to be part of the away game. When you think about playing the away game in the Pacific, to me the more apt analogy is 1941 to 1945, how hard it was to deal with a predominant regional naval power. And so the question I have is, the reason I'm pessimistic is it is so darn difficult to deal with that kind of a geostrategic environment over time. And it also makes me think then that actually the salience of nuclear weapons and the fact that both China and the United States have them, I think may wind up being the ultimate buffer to prevent any of the more apocalyptic outcomes that people talk about. So if you could both talk a little bit about both the away game in the Asia and then the salience of nuclear weapons in the current situation in Asia.
Let me start with the last point you made, which has to do with the salience of nuclear weapons. I agree with the point completely. And that's the reason why I believe we need to have a nuclear deterrent that survives with all the good characteristics of a nuclear deterrent. It has to be effective, so on and so forth. Thankfully for us, we don't have to do very much more in terms of numbers of weapons and so forth, because I think we have quite a bit in terms of capabilities. But you're absolutely right. The ultimate backstop are American nuclear capabilities. I think this administration has done a remarkable job in terms of investing in these capabilities, and I think any administration would continue to do that. Let me come back to the away game point in the conventional area. You're absolutely right that the Pacific, because of distances and so on and so forth, is going to be a challenge. But when I think of Chinese A2AD, which is what the real test ultimately is, right? To my mind, the biggest value of Chinese A2AD is until it's actually used. It's a psychological weapon in peacetime because there's nothing the United States can actually do about it. So when people start telling you, oh, we've got DF-21s and we've got, widget X and widget Y, oh, that's wonderful. Ooh, ooh, ooh. We're all supposed to be alarmed, right? The moment the balloon goes up, we know how to deal with Chinese A2AD. I mean, there are a whole range of things that we're going to do, from the non-kinetic to the kinetic. So the question is, when you actually come to the ultimate test of war, will this system keep us away from being able to credibly service our extended deterrence guarantees? My answer is no. Will it raise the cost? Yes, of course. But even as we speak, and Mike, you know this better than anybody else, the US Navy, the US Air Force, and even the US Army has gotten into the game of now trying to figure out, how to defeat Chinese A2AD. And the crazy thing about Americans is that once they concentrate, once the minds are concentrated and they put their resources to work, I mean, crazy things happen at the business end, So I'm not worried about that. For me, the bigger challenge is, can we do the right kinds of internal budget reallocations and the right kind of infrastructure development in the Asia Pacific that will support the kinds of capabilities that we need. And I think there is now a growing awareness that we do need to be smart in terms of the kinds of capabilities we have. So for example, emphasizing the long-range bomber component, emphasizing stealthy subsurface warfare where we have a terrific advantage, investing in deceptive operational maneuver capabilities so that you don't have to start hitting targets on the Chinese mainland and so on and so forth. So there are things that we are doing, and I'm confident we can actually do it within the budget caps because no one, as far as I know, is making the argument that in order to defeat Chinese A2AD, we need to add another $200 billion to the budget.
You want to add anything to that?
Sounds good to me.
No, actually, it doesn't sound good to me. I have one thing I'd like to add. Running out of time. Which is all the characteristics you mentioned of a safe nuclear deterrent. Is that how you put it? I forget exactly. Actually one of them runs counter to your argument for predominance, which is it's not enough for the United States to have all the nuclear weapons it may need. It's also important that China has enough nuclear weapons that it feels comfortable that it also deters the United States. And that's an area where predominance or imbalance, in the literature anyway, is generally regarded as destabilizing. So I think, in one respect, maybe a footnote to the report you might add would be, and of course the one area where we'd like to see China build up and get a little bit closer to the United States would be in the area of nuclear weapons deployments. But enough for that nuclear advertisement. Well, one in the back there.
Rob Spalding, Joint Staff. Just seems like both of you framed the question about...
Can you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, Rob Spalding, Joint Staff. It seems you both framed the question in terms of balance of power between the military sphere between the U.S. and China versus U.S. alliance system and China. Could you just explain why the difference there, number one? And then the other one is would it be possible to have a shared predominance, say one in the security sphere and one in the economic sphere?
Michael? I'm not sure I understand your first question. Could you?
Yeah, I didn't hear it either.
Well, so we talk numbers, but we talk numbers in terms of budget for the U.S. and China versus U.S. and its allies in China.
Well, I think much of this issue about balance of power in the region from a military perspective revolves around the kinds of things that we've been talking about, which is how much capability is enough to provide for security in the region, to avoid increasing the likelihood of crises, and if crises were to occur, to increase the likelihood of escalation. And I guess my argument is that the United States will not be able to field a force in the Western Pacific that will make that, even with Japanese support, as credible an argument about how it could prevent all those things and deal with that through a position of predominance as many people might think, including Ashley. I think the presence and activity of the Chinese military and paramilitary in that part of the Western Pacific will change perceptions. Even if there are latent counter A2A capabilities in certain areas, I don't think that that will change the fact that people will believe that there has been a shift and that that shift is moving more towards a balance in that part of the world. And that for the United States, the tendency will be to try to compensate for that perception by overreacting in a variety of ways as incidents occur to show that it doesn't, in fact, operate from a position of parity. It makes the crisis stability problem greater to have that kind of uncertainty in the minds of others, because it affects the calculus of American decision makers themselves in trying to disabuse others of that situation. So transition towards this kind of more perceived balanced situation is indeed a dangerous situation, which is exactly why I advocate that it has to be addressed much more effectively than it has been before, because I don't see the alternative of sustaining the kind of dominance that Ashley talks about as being either practical or, from a strategic point of view, prudent in terms of the way the reaction will occur in the region. And just on that point, I mean, regional countries themselves, they want the United States to be in the region. There's no question about it. And they want the United States to be strong in the region. And they want the United States to be able to deter aggressive action on the part of any country, particularly the Chinese. But the whole question becomes, what is that posture in terms of the relationship with the Chinese? This is not a one-sided issue here. The Chinese have recourse. They can respond. And if the United States doesn't position itself properly in the way it deals with Chinese responses, I don't think countries in the region are going to be too reassured if they see American behavior leading to an escalating spiral that ultimately leads to a Cold War in the region. That will not serve Allied interests. I mean, I've had Korean diplomats, some of them, mostly they talk about the alliance, but I've had some of them tell me, oh, ultimately we'll have to end up there. We'll have to have a unified Korea that is far less closely aligned to the United States to survive in this environment. Now, you can take issue with that, but it does convey that Allied thinking is not as clear established and as set as Ashley would suggest.
I think you're going to get the last word on this, Ashley.
I am going to get the last word.
He's going to say, oh, yes, it is.
No, the point I would make is I agree with much of what Michael has just said. But remember, in positioning ourselves for predominance, we are not talking of a new Cold War in the region. In fact, if you look at US policy towards the region in three areas, right? Political, economic, and military. The issues where the contestation is possibly greatest is actually in the military. In the political area, we have a broad understanding of what constitutes a stable Asian order. In the economic area, we are not looking to, pick sides or destroy any of the integration that has long been underway now for about 30 years. It all comes down to the military. And the military actually ends up, from my point of view, being a simple technical problem, which is how do I make certain that in the event of a crisis, I can operate in support of my allies, despite whatever the Chinese bring to the table in terms of their anti-access area denial problem. It's a simple military issue. And if I can solve that problem through my own means, then I end up reassuring the allies. I can fulfill all my extended deterrence obligations, and we can end up with a much more stable Asia Pacific than Michael fears will be the case.
Well, clearly they have not reconciled their differences, but I think they've at least illuminated some of the key questions, and I encourage everyone to follow the views of these two folks in their writings going forward. If you'll join me in thanking our speakers today. And thank everyone for attending.
Thank you, Avery. Thanks very much for coming down.
Pretty good. You're in California?
Yeah.
What are you doing in California?
I'm running Fair Observer from there, now 1,400 plus writers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
from over 40 countries and all my...
So it doesn't matter where you are, right?
Doesn't mind. My managing editor is